Welcome to This Isn't Working, the podcast for employers and employees who think it's time to talk about the failings of workplace culture and how we can do better.
I'm Julie Scanlon.
And I'm Tanya de Grunwald.
Okay, let's get this working.
Hi, Julie.
Hi, Tanya.
Right, so today we're talking about Stonewall. I think I'm ready. Are you ready?
Just about ready.
Okay, excellent. So this is a topic that's been on our radar for quite some time, really. And there's been a lot of news about it recently. So a couple of stories in the Telegraph recently, which I was actually quoted in a couple of them, and lots of talk about changes and movement and what's going on and how employers are responding. Mm-hmm. I think it's important to say up front that this is not going to be the podcast that does a sort of big old history of Stonewall and what it's all about, and right from the start and all of that kind of stuff. We feel that there's an awful lot of good stuff out there, particularly I would say the Nolan Investigates BBC Sounds podcast is one of the best things that I've heard and was pretty balanced, I thought. Did you listened to that one as well, haven't you?
Yeah, that's right. It's maybe 2 or 3 years ago now, is it? And it was quite a comprehensive series bringing out some of the challenges that people are having around Stonewall and their approach. And it was quite balanced as well, had kind of a range of perspectives on. So it was I can't even remember how many it was, 4 to 6, something like that.
Yeah.
We'll put the link in the notes to this podcast for people that want to go into that in more detail. But no, exactly. It's, as with our remit for our podcast today, we're really thinking much more about the employer's perspective, aren't we, as usual?
So I think, I guess what has been missing for me, although he did quite a good job of that, I thought, when talking about BBC particularly, and I think Ofcom as well, I don't think I've really heard any sort of deep dive from an employer perspective or a corporate perspective even. I just think it's been quite quiet on that front, possibly for good reason, as we're about to find out.
Yeah, exactly.
This was your idea, this podcast, Julie. So
stop it. This is
no.
One of the remits of this podcast to talk about the stuff that people aren't talking about. So here we go.
Exactly. So what we want to do today is do a bit of analysis into what we think is going on here. And one of the reasons why we think we've got something to contribute to this conversation is that we've actually been talking to lots of HR directors over the last kind of 4 or 5 months, I would say, with a particular interest in what's happening within DEI, and particularly looking at the trans and gender identity piece and where decisions have been made there, and whether those were the right decisions or whether we need to go back and look at it again to make sure that everybody has been considered properly. So in doing that, you and I have been talking to lots of HR directors. It's been quite a self-selecting group, I suppose, in some ways, in that it's been people who are particularly sort of attuned to, this is maybe a little bit more complicated than we originally thought it was. Yeah. So they're the sort of people who maybe were a little bit cautious about it, a little bit careful about it, and are now beginning to look at it differently again, and whether they can feed into some solutions for those who may have gone in a little bit too quickly and made some decisions that they might not otherwise have made. So it's looking like a very complex topic for employers. I really feel for them in that respect, because I think this is a really tough one. And as we'll discuss today, I think there's an awful lot that's gone against employers in this respect. From talking to them, I didn't really get a feeling that there was mega love for Stonewall or any kind of conspiracy, or I feel like a lot of people think that employers, I guess because of the Stonewall Diversity Champions scheme, which is quite controversial, and the Workplace Equality Index, which is their top employers to work for. I think some people think there's a sort of big conspiracy that corporations are really, really into this topic. I think it's really important to remember that it doesn't really seem like that. From our perspective, talking to HR directors, I would say that it's important to remember that this sort of gender piece is a relatively small part of DEI, which is a relatively small part of HR. So I think that's kind of important to set out, but we'll get more into the detail of that as we go along. Today we wanted to divide this conversation into 3 parts. So first of all, kind of what's happened and how did this happen? That's the first bit. We'll go into some of our thoughts on that. The second part is, why didn't employers take notice sooner? Or maybe they did and they didn't act sooner, question mark. And then the third part is, where do we go from here, and what now, what next? So again, I guess, I mean, we're not HR directors at big organizations, so we might,
No.
but we are going on what we've been told. So I hope that is going to be helpful. And I'm sure as we publish this, we will get people telling us that we've got some of it right and some of it less right. But we're just going to push on because we think it's a conversation that needs to kind of get started. I think that's probably reasonable to start with that. So let's kick off with the first part. How did this happen? I feel like Stonewall at the moment is becoming a problem, is already become a problem, many people would say. But I think in terms of the employer radar, I would say it used to be a solution. That was why it became part of the employer space, wouldn't you say? What problem was it solving?
Yeah, absolutely agree. I mean, a problem it was solving was around initially LGB inclusion, because Stonewall didn't always represent the T. Now, of course, they do. And so the problem was, to ensure that employees were progressing through with those particular characteristics, and also that the employment space and the bringing people in, bringing new talent in, that there was no discrimination happening. And because, of course, LGBT, LGB and T people are minority, they're a minority within an organization as well. So you don't have that necessarily that expertise within in-house that you're able to draw on in particular. And again, that depends upon the size of your organization and the complexity and all that sort of thing. So, employers needed somewhere to trust, to get advice, to get some guidance. And Stonewall had an amazing reputation, and for many people it still does, of course. But it had an amazing reputation, particularly in those early days when employers were getting involved because of all the grassroots work that it had done. It was the kind of lobby group, really, that sort of fought for so many rights that we in the UK benefit from.
It seemed to be like the sort of perfect partner, if you like, because it had all of that sort of political, historical experience, and they also seemed to be doing a really good job of doing, proper advice that people felt they could trust. Whether or not they could trust it is another issue, but they definitely seem to be the sort of perfect supplier in that respect. I would say I can see why, as an off-the-shelf solution, that was a big winner for employers, and they could just say, "Great, we've done it. We know we've done it well because this is partnering with Stonewall, and everyone thinks, great, this is great. We don't have to think about this anymore." Do you know when they actually started working with employers, and was that always part of the plan?
I don't know if it was always part of the plan. I think that's an interesting question. I doubt it. I mean, Stonewall set up in 1989 to fight Section 28, which was a sort of part of the law in this country which prohibited local authorities from talking about or kind of promoting, and that's the term used in that act, homosexuality. It wasn't to do with employment per se. It had an impact in local authorities, it had an impact in schools, etc., etc. So that was its kind of key issue that it's set up around. Then it was, now I jotted it down here, they started their diversity champion scheme in 2001.
Oh, wow.
And that's the first. That is still kind of a long time ago. Oh, it feels like a long time ago, longer than I realised. And at this time, they were representing LGBT people only. It was still around that, what is now the protected characteristic of sexual orientation. So it is quite some time that they've been working with employers. And then I was looking at the dates. The first Workplace Equality Index, as you touched on that already, came out in 2005. So there've clearly been, a lot of hand-in-hand, very positive work in those early days, which kind of further establishing them as the place to go to for guidance. I mean, now Stonewall is I believe, the kind of the biggest LGBT lobby group across Europe, and it works kind of worldwide and globally. And there's a global equality index now since 2014 as well. So there's this sense of all of that kind of the grassroots work they've done around Section 28, the advocacy work, really hard fought for, and then things around same-sex adoption, same-sex civil partnership, and then marriage. Stonewall's been sort of huge in just helping particularly LGBT people be accepted as ordinary folk, really, and that's kind of been very much their sort of ethos is to sort of make sure that that we're not discriminated against and we're just treated like any other people, whilst recognising our difference, of course.
So I've always had a slight question mark over what Stonewall actually is and was, and whether it occupies quite an unusual slot in the kind of roster of what you and I would consider suppliers for employers, because it's always had this political angle. And I'm trying to think of any other example of any sort of political type advocacy group, if that's what we're saying it is. It's an advocacy group, it's a charity, but it seems to be also have a license, I mean, not an actual license, but be allowed to do some quite punchy campaigning at the same time as working alongside employers. And it's quite an unusual space to be in. I actually can't think of another sort of comparable organisation that's doing that while working with huge corporations. So maybe that was our first sign that something was a little bit off or different about this organisation, and maybe should always have been, a little quiet alarm bell should have been going off maybe right from the start. There was at least scope for things to go awry if and when things changed.
I mean, I think that what you say is right in terms of it's certainly the biggest and the kind of the loudest voice, if you like, and all of the other LGBT organisations that also are suppliers to employers kind of follow Stonewall's premise and kind of use its glossary and that kind of thing. So it's kind of at the forefront, and it's the biggest, and it's the one that people will most be familiar with. And there are interesting questions around. It is an activist group. It's a lobby group, quite kind of deliberately is campaigning for change, kind of upfront. I guess, do we get any of this in terms of other protected characteristics? Sometimes, I guess we might have some kind of suppliers, as it were, that are procured that are activists in the spaces of anti-racism and kind of race equality. But it doesn't seem to be quite as, closely aligned. And this is partly because of the Diversity Champion Scheme and the Workplace Equality Index, which have come to be really big and on a whole kind of, well thought of indicators in relation to how you're doing in relation to this particular kind of inclusion. So that there's nothing else, there's no other kind of thing that I can think of, although listeners can, this is off the top of my head, this bit, so listeners can let us know if there are, but it seems to be very significant in relation to that hand-in-hand employer and Stonewall kind of working relationship, really.
The only other example that pops into my head would be sort of sustainability activism and how closely they would work with organizations in that space. I just feel like as a supplier to big corporations, it kind of goes with the territory that you're not supposed to be that political, or certainly party political, or sort of pushing a very strong agenda. That just feels a little bit odd to me. I know, I just put you on the spot there. Sorry, but it's something about that feels a bit odd to me as well. Just while we're talking it through.
I mean, because when we're thinking about diversity within organizations and how much we know that generally benefits organisations, or we hope that we know that. It can be challenging to have something that is very political with a small p and activist with a big A or a small a.
What I'm wondering is maybe it didn't feel political. Maybe it got filed under right thing to do, right side of history.
I think so.
Not even a question anymore. So it wasn't even considered. Maybe that's what happened here.
I think you're absolutely right. The right side of history, because we're talking about also, it's a social movement, how kind of rights progress and rights move on. So this isn't only an employer issue. So employers are also struggling with what is our relationship to these social issues, these social movements that are emerging. So this has just become bigger and bigger and bigger. as you say, with the sort of sustainability goals as well, is perhaps another, that employers are not, they're kind of in conversation at times with some of those big broader issues because they're composed of the human beings who are also concerned and involved in them.
So we've sort of seen over time, I would say, there's been quite a change in direction, change in strategy, leadership, priorities for Stonewall, in terms of, because it was kind of a shift, was it around sort of middle of the 2010s, 2015? I mean, I haven't been watching this quite as closely as you have been. And I guess it was just kind of in my kind of rearview mirror a little bit. What do you sense from that history and from an employer perspective?
Well, they definitely, there was a big shift really in Stonewall in 2015 when they started focusing not only on sexual orientation, but on trans and what we would now call gender identity, or not what now is called gender identity, which was kind of nowhere in Stonewall's remit previously. But with consultation with trans people, they kind of enveloped that in, which then made it the LGBT organisation that it is today, an LGBTQ IAA, etc., that we get, depending on who you're sort of talking to and listening to. So it was a big shift at that time because that meant, in terms of legally and in terms of the employment situation, we had the Equality Act 2010. So we're now talking about at least two protected characteristics, which they were not representing before, and those characteristics were gender assignment and gender reassignment, and sexual orientation. So that was a big shift. So you've got employers already involved with Stonewall, using their guidance, working towards being in the Workplace Equality Index, that kind of top 100, and kind of will just kind of be following along on that reputation that Stonewall had, perhaps not even realizing, kind of what shift there'd been in that. Who they represent internally was quite significantly shifted at that point.
Yeah, I don't really remember any discussion around that at the time. I mean, I wasn't working as closely with employers as I am now, but I don't remember any kind of big moment when it was like, hurrah, now the T is part of LGBT. I just don't remember that. Suddenly it was like LGBT, LGBTQ, and everybody sort of thought, oh, this is all kind of like the new gay. I don't really get this, but all right, let's go along with it. This seems fine.
Yeah.
I don't know. It was quite uncritically welcomed, and quite often when you would go, I mean, I went to a couple of events. I remember one in 2018 for employers, and there was a young trans man there who was very engaging and entertaining, and everyone was like, oh, I don't, this is a different perspective, I haven't heard this before, why not include people like this is great. It just didn't seem to be there was no issue with it, and that person obviously wasn't looking to create any problems, and seemed very bright and ambitious and all the rest of it, just the kind of person you would want working for you in your organisation. So it just didn't really seem to have any alarm bells at the time, for me anyway. I didn't really see any conflict of rights kind of coming on the horizon. So, but maybe I'm just going to play the sort of slightly dopey straight blonde on this podcast, but I think that's probably where a lot of people were, just accepting everything at face value, good intentions, didn't really see any problems with this. So
yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think that was my response as well. It just felt like an extension, and kind of why not. So there had been Stonewall did significant consultation with trans people themselves, and then kind of decided to sort of fold this in. I think what we have now, and the way that kind of things have shifted since then, since 2015, is much more of an emphasis on kind of asking, and this is where we get these kind of conflicts of rights, is asking for employers and for the employee culture to kind of really privilege things like gender identity in relation to the use of pronouns, and not just for the people themselves, but for all of us to sort of use pronouns, etc. And this was not, this kind of, I'm going to call it an ask, has been sort of building over the last few years. I think that we've seen how there are different elements of the Equality Act that are coming in that are, telling us, because people have won cases, that there is a clash of rights here. And so I think employers at the moment are finding themselves in a difficult situation where they're seeing, oh, actually, what we've been doing has perhaps not been as equitable as we thought it would be, or as we thought we were doing. So yes, of course, this is our employer's perspective. Of course, we want to be inclusive of trans people. Of course, we want to make sure that everybody can work comfortably within our organisation, can be respected, cannot be discriminated against. But what they've done is kind of followed a line which actually means that they've been ignoring some of the bigger picture in terms of the Equality Act. And I'm thinking obviously of the gender critical cases we've had recently. So I think it's been a massive challenge for employers because they've simply been trusting and kind of being advised in that kind of same way. And now they're like, oh, hang on, kind of what's going on? Why are we getting these things? And have found themselves almost like for taking a position, a political with a small p position, when that is not how their involvement perhaps started with Stonewall. So I think they're in a, I feel for them being in this kind of tricky spot, where some of the HR directors that we've been talking to have been sort of really sharing some of those concerns about directions their organisations have gone in. Of course, they have been a self-selecting group, as you've mentioned, because a lot of people still don't want to talk about this. And we may well get cancelled because we've had this conversation. So
Well,
we're ready for it.
Let's hope not.
Let's hope not.
Yeah, I mean, I thought one of the other things that came out from talking to the HR directors, and we should say that we're not just having chats with them, we are working on a sort of roadmap to help them to navigate a way through this kind of situation that they find themselves in now. A lot of them raise the issue of religious belief and also culture, and whether they have overlooked the fact that certain religions, I think there's been a case to do with Christianity, where that appears to kind of clash with gender identity. But I don't think, as far as I'm aware, I don't think there's been a case where somebody who's Muslim or Jewish or Hindu or any other of the major world religions has put their hand up and say they had a problem with some of this stuff, particularly some of the training that people are going to. But I would imagine some of this is not landing brilliantly with them. And I think it's been a mistake to assume that silence has meant agreement from those groups and that they don't have an opinion. I'm just assuming that they are finding a way to deal with it, but they're not talking about it. But I would imagine that that is a moment of discomfort for them. And I think the idea that employers are potentially putting that onto their employees with all sorts of different backgrounds. And I think people with gender critical or sex realist, it's sometimes called, isn't it now, beliefs are considered a sort of subgroup of not very kind, usually women, middle-aged women. But even if you don't care about them, which you should do, and even if you don't care about Christian people, which apparently seems to be quite common from what I'm seeing, and I accept that as being a controversial thing to say, they sort of should care about those other groups because they put so much work into being inclusive of other cultures and religions. It seems very off-key to force them to keep quiet and pretend they believe stuff when they don't. It seems very odd to me.
I mean, we know that at what I'll call the more conservative edge of pretty much every religion, there is, a belief in two sexes, that they're usually also against gay or lesbian relationships, for example, and that their beliefs are protected. And I guess also, as well as that, that the religion element and the belief element, I think perhaps employers don't realise how contentious this area is within the LGBT or LGB and T space as well. I speak, this is the space that I work within, and I speak with a lot of people that are defined as same-sex attracted people, which Stonewall don't represent anymore. Stonewall say that we needs to be same gender attracted, and it kind of pretty much actively campaigns against same-sex attracted people. So if you're a gender critical lesbian or you're a gender critical gay man or bisexual person, there is no space for you in the Stonewall remit anymore, and there used to be. Now, it's massive within this community. I'm going to put that in inverted commas, and it's a massive divide which has kind of sprung up around the gender identity issue. There's not necessarily any kind of clear way forward for employers to deal with that, but what they're finding is, I think, with these gender critical cases, we're also interesting. Quite a few of them have been brought, successful ones have been brought by lesbians. And so this is not a coincidence. So it's very challenging, I think, for employers. And they've found themselves aligning with a particular route in that kind of small p. And just, if people might be surprised to hear that when Nancy Kelly was CEO of Stonewall, she's not anymore. There was something leaked, an email which was leaked, which showed that she was calling same-sex attracted lesbians sexual racists. Now that caused an enormous upset within that, this so-called community of which I'm part.
I never quite understood that. Can you just explain to me why? I mean, it doesn't sound like a compliment, but why is that so offensive? I mean, I think I get it, but can you just join the dots, as it were?
I can join the dots. I can, yeah. So, because Stonewall and Nancy Kelly, through that comment, because they prioritize gender identity, they prioritize the fact that that people can identify into whatever kind of gender they feel that they're most comfortable with. So this doesn't necessarily mean making any kind of changes to your body in what we might have thought of, I guess, in a sort of earlier times where people tended to think of transgender people and kind of transsexual people as people that would make some kind of alterations to their bodies. That we've moved into a different world now, where when people are saying that they're transgender, we might get a transgender lesbian, for example. Somebody that was born male is now identifying as a woman and is identifying as a lesbian woman, but they may have an entirely intact male body. So no kind of alteration whatsoever. They may be, to an extent, living as a woman or kind of living as a lesbian. So some lesbians, and I'm talking about lesbians here, but we're obviously talking about gay men and anyone actually that defines their sexual orientation as based on sex, and this would include all the heterosexual people who do so as well. So what she said, Kelly's point there was that and it was about lesbians, so if lesbians don't accept people with male bodies who identify as lesbians into, for example, their dating pool, into their dating apps, into the kind of lesbian spaces that occasionally still exist, but not so much anymore, then that they were racist, that it was the same as being a racist. As though kind of you and I sitting here as white men, as if we were saying, I would not date a black person.
Okay.
So this caused this was like kind of like lighting a fire really when this came out.
Is she a lesbian?
She is a lesbian, yes,
okay.
But obviously defines her sexual orientation in relation to gender identity. I mean, what's interesting, it's a whole kind of thorny knot at the moment around sexual orientation's definition within the Equality Act. It does use the word sex in terms of sexual orientation, which we have always, until very recently, in every kind of discourse, taken that as to be male or female. So there are challenges. The way that some organisations, including Stonewall, are reading that word sex are also different to the way that it used to be read as well. It's too complex probably to go into on this podcast. But is that semi-helpful?
It goes to show,
it
goes to show the complexity, because I don't think a lot of people, let alone employers, have really understood that this has all been going on in the background and exactly what the issue is and why there is this split. And I've learned a lot about it recently as well, that there is this kind of split. And so any talk of the LGBT community or LGBTQ plus or whatever, however people are choosing to present it, even in doing that, my understanding from what you're saying is there's a lot of people who would say they're either lesbian, gay, or bisexual, who might say, I don't love that term and this is why, because I'm not really on board with people who identify as trans or whatever the Q means, which I understand is either questioning or queer. I don't use the word queer.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm 44 and I just never a word that it was always offensive and I just never use it. So I've been rather puzzled by why it's popped up again. So I think I was aware something strange was going on, and some younger people are into it and older people aren't, not necessarily, but so I'm kind of aware there is some stuff going on. Which is
very contentious.
Right. Yeah. So I think it's
a contentious term.
Worth those of us, kind of switching our brains on if we haven't been paying attention before. I'm going to move on. I'm going to move on to sort of why we think that employers didn't kind of take notice of this sooner. Because it seems like something that is kind of should have popped up on their radar but didn't. So I think from what we've gathered from talking to the HR directors, there's a sense of kind of following the crowd, which has happened. And this became this quite quickly sort of enveloped everybody and became just a thing that everyone was doing. I think there was a sort of Stonewall legacy reputation, which I think was really, really powerful. And I think gave employers confidence that this was something that wasn't that big a shift from whatever they'd been doing before. I think they sort of were happy to trust in that respect. I think there's something quite appealing about being able to outsource sort of thought and responsibility to another safe pair of hands that you kind of, you've trusted before and they seem like good guys and whatever, we're happy with this. And I think this idea of sort of LGBT, I just think they didn't realize that there might be any kind of any sort of nuance between the L or the G or the B or the T or the Q or any or all bits of these together. I think it was just like, oh, well, all people in that group all think the same. So if I found one person who thinks trans women are women, then I assume that all people think that in this group. And there might be lots of lesbians who would say that, but there's also some lesbians who would not say that. And there are some gay men who would say that and some gay men who would not say that. And I think from the perspective of somebody who's not from that, by putting it in air quotes, community, because I know we're not convinced that such a thing exists if it ever did. It's like it was quite complicated to think, well, maybe the one person that I'm speaking to is not representative of all these people, and maybe they know more than I do, so they must represent all of their people, even though not. So I think maybe there was a bit of that going on, and maybe younger people seem to be taking the lead on it. And again, there might be a bit of an age issue going on here. So I think some of that was going on.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot easier, isn't it, if it is a simple story and you can you sort of know what to do with people. It's just not a simple story. I mean, it's like a few years ago, most people stopped using that term BAME because it was just almost meaningless in terms of all the different people that you had under that umbrella. So the government stopped using it, BBC stopped using it, and we're using lots of different terms actually now. And I think that there is that, as you say, just it was building on the legacy and trust that that Stonewall had, and obviously for many people still does have. And so like, why do you want to get your head into the complexity of it? But what we're seeing now, actually, you may need to get your head into the complexity of this because there are legal issues, there are legal implications.
Do you think? I wonder if the people who were not into it were also not speaking up.
Quite possibly, yeah. It is because there's become a dominant narrative, there's become a dominant voice, and it makes it hard to speak up. So any same-sex attracted lesbians or gay men or bi people who orientate based on sex, they will not be, or I'd be extraordinarily surprised if they were in your LGBTQ, ERG or staff network, whatever you're calling it, because they're not going to be welcome there, and they know they're not going to be welcome there. So you're not really, well, you're very unlikely to be getting their voices. When you're hearing from your LGBTQ group, you're very unlikely to be getting their voices in. So there is that element of, keeping quiet, getting on with your job, doing your own thing, but you're not actually feeling included.
Yeah, I don't know
say.
if employers are aware of that. I wonder if they're aware that their LGBT groups tend to be fairly young, and maybe they would, and maybe they just think maybe older people are not that into this group. But I wonder if they would necessarily have realised that it might be an issue like that has maybe led to people self-excluding because they realise they can't say what they want to say, or they just don't feel this group
Yeah, I mean,
represents them anymore.
yeah, you won't even know if people are self-excluding because they'll be doing so quietly, obviously. And I don't know that. I think what you say about, is it a generational thing? I'm not entirely sure what those demographics would look like. Each organisation should have that. Any bigger organisation should have that anyway. And thinking about, okay, what voices are you not hearing from? And what routes are there for those voices actually to be heard? Yeah.
Okay, and I think, yeah, so I think I certainly don't remember reading very much about this in the press. I think I was aware of LGB Alliance when they started, and they were sort of presented as, I'm not even quite sure what I even thought LGB Alliance was. The sort of alternative to Stonewall, and everyone loves Stonewall, so therefore LGB Alliance, you have to draw your own conclusions about what LGB Alliance is. And I suppose I wasn't really aware that what they were doing and why they were doing it, and I think that's becoming much clearer now.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the LGB Alliance have been very clear. When they set up, they did so as a kind of last resort, because they really tried to speak with Stonewall. They tried to engage with Stonewall to say, kind of, could there be room for us as well? And that us is, same-sex attracted. And that fell on deaf ears. So, their story is kind of public. And so they didn't want to set up a separate organisation like Who would. But they were kind of forced to, because there is a whole swathe of people that are not represented under Stonewall, that many, I think, from the outside of the community, in inverted commas, don't kind of recognise. But then, of course, LGB Alliance get so much sort of challenge and flack for excluding the T and excluding the concept of gender identity. They're founded upon the characteristic of sexual orientation, and that doesn't go down well with kind of mainstream voices, mostly in this kind of working in this space. But they're entitled to exist. They're a charity. They're entitled to exist. They represent a lot of people. They're very important for a lot of people. I guess I'd also mention here, there are other organisations, quite small and not well known, maybe sort of the Lesbian Project, for example, Gay Men's Network, people that are trying to find spaces for themselves because they are not welcome in those kind of, I'm going to call them mainstream LGBTQ spaces anymore. But so they're not welcome in those spaces, and yet they also get pilloried for setting up their own spaces or their own kind of networks and organisations, which they're entirely entitled to do so.
Complicated stuff. Okay.
It is. And yeah, so if you're an HR director and you're thinking about the economy, COVID, there's a lot of other restructures, redundancies.
Workforce planning.
It's like this little, what feels like this little thing. How come, this is imploding? It ought not to be taking this time and resource to sort of sort out.
Yeah. I'm wondering if it was fair.
So
is it fair to expect them to have paid this much attention to what was quite a small issue for them? I do think, and actually the HR directors we've spoken to have said, look, this all comes back to HR directors, so they're happy to take the flak themselves, and they're like, this all comes back to HR directors, and where you've got a problem, it's because the HR director either wasn't paying attention, outsourced responsibility, possibly to their head of DEI, who they trusted and got in to deal with all this stuff so they wouldn't have to. and something has gone awry there and they've not grasped the nettle quickly enough. I think it does all come back to them. It just seems out of character to me. The whole thing is out of character to me, that it's not out of character that they weren't paying attention to something that seemed like such a niche issue to them. And to be fair, it wasn't well reported in the press. So I think journalism has not done a great job here, for sure. And I'm not sure I know a lot of people have theories about why that is and what's gone wrong there. That's for another podcast for another day. But to be fair to the employers, this wasn't something that was going to be obvious to them was a problem. What it does seem out of character is that they weren't more worried about legal risk, particularly after the Maya Forstater case, which I would have thought should have landed on everybody's desk. Like, okay, it seems that her beliefs, which I think are reasonably, would they be straightforwardly described as sex realist now? As in, I think she believes that there are two sexes and that's it. And
gender critical or sex realist I use these days sort of interchangeably.
So when that landed, you would have thought all the HR directors in the UK would have gone, right, we need to check that we're not on the wrong side of this. We need to go back again. It doesn't matter what our head of DEI thinks on this issue. It doesn't matter what our young ones in that team think. We've got to make sure we've got this right. And I'm not quite sure why that happened, why that didn't happen. Again, I suppose it was around the sort of time of the sort of fog of, heading into COVID. And I don't know, a lot of stuff, I think there's sort of confusion around this issue. And I think we also need to remember that HR directors are typically in their, I would say, 40s, 50s, and possibly a little bit older, and they've got their own, they've got their own kids and their own families and aging parents and a million things to do on top of their role, which is also, as we've just kind of alluded to, the complexity of the million things that they do. I think they had their own stuff going on, and I just think they took their eye off the ball with this. That's what it seems like to me. I don't get the feeling that they're all super on board with this and love Stonewall. I think it was just kind of in a blind spot. That's more the impression that I get.
Yeah, and I think even with Forstater's case, it probably felt like it was, this niche thing that, the DEI person might be able to deal with, or, sort of just kind of absorb that in to the way that they were doing their training and kind of, but it's clearly not what happened, because we've had so many subsequent cases from gender critical or sex realist people that have, succeeded, and kind of the employers have had to pay out over it. I think it was just still seen as niche and, what's one employment law case, but it was actually pivotal in terms of this relationship between kind of gender identity belief and because it absolutely, those beliefs absolutely run counter to what Stonewall is proposing and what Stonewall is advocating the culture of an organisation ought to be like.
Yeah, I'm wondering if people did raise it.
That's my understanding.
I'm wondering if people did raise it and they got shouted down or sort of shamed, or they saw someone else raising a similar question and that didn't land well, and they thought, what, I'm not really incentivized to make a big fuss about this. I'm just going to keep quiet. Well, now, where are we going to go from here? We've got a bunch of, I do actually feel for the employers, because I think from here they're in a tough spot. I think the ones who are still connected with Stonewall have got a question to look at very, very seriously within the next. I'm assuming they've been looking at it over the last few months. We should say that the Workplace Equality Index top 100 LGBTQ employers usually comes out in February every year. It has not come out yet, and we're in May. I went to the Stonewall Workplace Conference in end of March, and they told me there that it was coming out this year during Pride season. I wasn't aware that Pride is now a season, but apparently it is. So I don't know whether that means any time between, I guess, end of May and then into June. I don't know. I think that probably means during the summer.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
It sounds a little bit odd to me. I thought it was a bit odd at the time. The whole thing was very odd. They wouldn't let me in. Anyway, that's for another day, even though I paid. I had a very strange day there. Anyway, but just before they kicked me out, so weird. I wanted to try and learn about what they were talking about, and they wouldn't let me go. Anyway, it was very odd. But they did say that it was coming out during Pride season. And I sort of wondered, is something going on there? I might be totally wrong. but I'm a naturally slightly suspicious person. And I'm wondering
No.
if some employers are wobbling about whether they want to be on it this year, and whether they applied and they're on the list and they've been told where they are, but they're suddenly thinking, oh, I'm not sure it's a great look to be on that list this year because they've been associated with all these problems. Do you want to mention Hilary Cass at this point? Because that has probably...
I was just...
Yeah. Because I think
that was just popping into my head. Just popping into my head as you were speaking.
We don't, this is not the podcast about medicalising children with gender distress. And this shouldn't really... Well, it is a slight employer issue, I think. That's another question. But I think it has come into this conversation because I think the Cass review has changed the broader conversation. And I think employers are beginning to see this as a terribly complex area, then they had not quite taken into account how complex it is. What do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So just for listeners, most people probably are familiar with the Cass review, but it came out maybe about a month ago. And it was very critical of the services that people that struggle with gender and kind of gender identity have been receiving through the NHS and the kind of Tavistock clinic. So it was very critical of the use of, as you've used that term, medicalisation, which I guess is the sort of shorthand way, and was much more about really advocating for a full kind of explorative sort of psychological assessments of people, which it found hadn't been happening with the gender identity clinic, Tavistock. It came on the back of another thing, which kind of may feel like it's not relevant to employers, but is, because, kind of Stonewall was advocating for this, was around the puberty blockers. So it came in England and Wales. There was, just before the Cass review, it had already been decided not to use puberty blockers for young people in the way that it had been doing, unless it was kind of part of a specific trial. So two quite big things have happened, really quite literally in the last 2-3 months. And so we're getting the evidence base, so the NHS stepping back from, these particular services, the Cass review, comprehensive piece of work. I know it's been critiqued, but in my view appears to be a comprehensive piece of work. I'm not a medical doctor, different kind of doctor, not a very helpful one. And I think it was when organisations have Stonewall or other kind of the big LGBT kind of advocacy groups in, they tend to, take the approach that puberty blockers, HRT are a good thing. And so you are making a decision by having those organisations within your organisation. This is all very new, of course, kind of because it's shifting ground all the time. But I guess maybe something here is for employers to always kind of assess who they're having those relationships with, I guess, as they do in relation to the Workplace Equality Index as well. But this is so live that it need, just in terms of employment law and kind of the potential risk, just really needs to keep a close eye on this stuff, I think.
Yeah, I think they felt out of their depth in a way that they weren't really expecting to have to cope with all this. And I'm assuming there will be.
Yeah.
Well, we know that within big organisations there will be parents of children who are identifying as trans, and different families will be coping with that in different ways. So you've got all of that as well, and suddenly you're into terribly sensitive territory here, which a lot of employers, I can imagine, thinking, oh, this is beyond the scope of what we should be, what we should have an opinion on or a view on as an organisation.
I know.
And somehow Stonewall is sort of pulling them into that, which they don't want to be in. This is terribly personal stuff that people are coping with within their own families. So I think that's a concern. And there may be detransitioners as well within some of their groups, within some of their graduate cohorts. I've been thinking about maybe, so you've got to start thinking about all of these different groups. Yeah, and I just think they haven't been ready for it. So I think that they've got a question to answer as to whether they want to stay on the list or whether they want to drop off the list. If they stay on the list, they're going to get questions about why they're on the list and why they're still associating with Stonewall. If they drop off the list, they're going to get questions about why they've dropped off the list. I think my prediction would be that quite a few will drop off the list this year. I think they will say that they're reviewing budgets. I've heard that it's actually quite a lot of work to even complete the questionnaire to apply for the Workplace Equality Index. So, and we do know that all these organisations are having restructures and tightening belts. So it's an awful lot of work.
Yeah.
I don't think it's that expensive to apply, but I think it's an awful lot of man hours collecting the data that the index requires. So I think they'll say that they're reviewing budgets, and they were strapped for cash and strapped for time, and it just doesn't make sense. And they continue to support their LGBTQ, and I think they will keep using that term for a while. They continue to support those groups in other ways. And I don't know if they're going to get backlash or not from their own employees, but I think that's a sort of trade-off they're going to have to work out what they want to do with that. I think they're going to need to start recognising a range of different perspectives on these issues and find a way to step away from it and say, this is not a work thing. We need to remove ourselves from this organisation. I think Pride is going to be very, very interesting to see how much they get into this and how much they step back from that. I think, in terms of I don't know, it feels a little bit like Stonewall. Do you think it can be saved? I'm starting to think it's kind of, I think if the employers start stepping back, I think it's over. I think if there was a moment when it was going to be saved, it would have been when employers started dropping off the list a couple of years ago, more than that. We've seen, I think it was Arts Council England and Sport England have dropped off this year. I think Sport England most recently.
Very recent, yeah.
But you would have thought if they were going to review what they were doing and their direction of travel, they would have done it when they lost some of the much bigger names. Those are big names, but for some of the other big names. And given that they haven't, I don't really see any evidence that there's any self-reflection really going on there. And I think they're in a tough spot themselves, Stonewall, because they've got a lot of members now who are all bought into a particular direction of travel. And if they suddenly say, oh, actually, we're not going to do that because some of the big corporations, some of the UK's biggest corporations don't like it, that's not going to land well with your particularly young, idealistic activists. They're going to say, what are you doing? And I think there are questions already about pinkwashing and what these corporations are even doing in this space in the first place. And I think they're beginning to wonder that themselves, some of them.
Yeah, potentially, as Pride Month is coming up in June, so many of us are dreading that. I know when we did our International Women's Day podcast, we were talking about how much we were potentially dreading the day, not because of kind of what it means or any sort of commitment, but the to the kind of those issues, but it is the sense of what are organisations doing when they're making it so, it's so pinkwashed and it sort of becomes kind of meaningless. Last year I saw one of the most ridiculous things was, when you get on your app, when you're getting a parcel delivered, and the parcel that was being delivered to my house was, instead of the little delivery van to tell you where it was a rainbow unicorn, because this was for Pride Month. That just makes me kind of want to be sick, frankly.
Did the unicorn
and I'm
turn
a lesbian.
up?
It's supposed to. It did turn up. Unfortunately, it was just a van. That was the particularly disappointing thing. If it's an actual unicorn,
I'm not going to ask
you
what the parcel was, but it probably wasn't anything very exciting that the unicorn could bring.
I'm sure it wasn't anything very exciting. It didn't deserve its own unicorn to deliver it.
Oh, it could only be a disappointment.
But it can. People are just annoyed with some of this stuff, but it has a political edge, and as you're saying there, I'm not sure. What Stonewall say, because we're noticing big names drop off. Drop off the Workplace Equality Index. What they say is, other names are coming in to replace. So they do kind of defend themselves with that. It's hard to know, as external people, we can't keep such a close eye on everything, and who's just pausing it for a year or whatever. But the overarching trend and the kind of the critique that we're seeing in the press, etc., would suggest that it would benefit Stonewall if they rethought what they were doing. and kind of what that messaging is, instead of it feels like sort of a hunkering down mentality, and it's disappointing. It's, you know, we need to be able to kind of move forward. They need to be able to move forward with employers if they're going to genuinely continue supporting them, but rather than potentially even kind of causing problems through the Diversity and Inclusion Equality Act and so forth. Diversity Inclusion, Equality Act. That sounded a bit strange. So yeah, I think it's such a challenging space. It's hard to know what's going to happen. Lots of people still feel very supported by Stonewall. Of course, we've kind of brought out some of the critique today, but there is that, you know, there's that kind of big other side of lots of people still do feel supported by it. So what do we do around that kind of divide?
I can't really see anything that's could replace Stonewall at the moment. I mean, I just, and I wonder if employers would have learnt the lesson from outsourcing all their thinking anyway on one particular issue to one organisation. In the end, I think it made them pretty vulnerable. Talk about eggs and baskets, you know, it doesn't seem like a smart strategy. So in terms of life after Stonewall, we're looking at possibly there being, well, I think looks quite likely from what you're saying, a sort of LGB split with from the TQ, or the whole thing falls apart. I don't know. We just say, actually, all these groups have got different interests. Like BAME, why are we even doing this? And then within the groups, you've got different, you know, so it doesn't seem to, I just think that it sort of feels kind of lazy. And I think having been so slow to understand there was a problem with it at all, I think employers have got the potential to do even more damage by getting it wrong when trying to fix it somehow. I don't know. It sounds like a big...
Exactly.
And I wonder what they'll do about the LGBT employee resource groups, their kind of internal staff networks as well. Is it time to just look at disbanding those until we can find a better way of doing that? I don't know what we're doing anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are massive questions for employers, and, you know, it is part of what we've been co-creating our roadmap to, you know, support them to kind of find ways through this minefield, which, you know, the human resources directors, all the conversations that we've been having have really helped us to do that. So I think it's still probably going to be some time before we see how employers on the whole are going to respond to what feels, I know I'm in like a small little bubble, but it feels like a kind of crisis at the moment in relation to this. There's a lot happening. There's a lot that can go wrong for employers. So it feels as though they do need to be waking up, paying attention, asking the right questions. And I think that is down to human resources directors to kind of get under the skin as much as they can to understand what's going on.
Okay, well, it's a lot for them to get on with. I mean, I guess they can get in touch if they want to hear what the other ones are talking about. So if you're listening to this thinking,
yeah, they can.
Uh-oh, this is me. Or, I mean, it's possible also that it wasn't your mess that you made, kind of thing. I think a lot of people have inherited roles.
I agree.
And I think you know, I think a lot of people, maybe some of the more experienced people, left the workforce at exactly the time this was happening, and maybe it was left to more inexperienced people who kind of inherited it and have since realised it's actually decisions have been made that they wouldn't have made and they even weren't responsible for. So now they've got to go back through what has happened from their predecessor and maybe even the person before that. So they need to do quite a forensic, I think they need to do quite a forensic deep dive. I mean, we've started making our lists. I mean, it's pages and pages long already, but I think that needs to be what has happened, then bits of it need to be unpicked. And that's going to be quite a big job, but I don't really see any other way to do it. And I think this summer, as you say, I think there's going to be some big conversations around Pride this summer, and I think it feels like those need to be had, really. And I think I fear it might be rather bad-tempered, the whole thing. But as you say, I think it maybe needs to happen. It reminds me a little bit of Brexit. It's just kind of people need to have unpleasant conversations and realise that they don't agree on stuff and work out what's going on here, what this is all about. And be more aware of all the different groups involved here. I don't know who. Yeah. I don't think there is going to be another Stonewall again. I think LGB Alliance are doing good work representing their own people in their own way. I think that's great, but I just can't at the moment see employers saying, "Hey, we've ditched Stonewall and we're getting LGB Alliance in." But I think why not? From a range of perspectives. I think they will realise they need a range of perspectives, and it should never have been
Yeah.
about what the head of DEI or the head of DEI's team personally thought about these issues themselves. That's my
I think it's
takeaway.
so key. The range of perspectives is so key, because that's what has been getting organizations into trouble, is not having a range, in which then you kind of bring things kind of into that center, thinking particularly about your legal risk, and also, supporting all employees in the workplace. So I think it's that. Yeah, I mean, that's the real big kind of takeaway. We need genuinely that diversity of perspectives to be just enabled, really, so that culture is there.
Right, well, one to watch. I think it's going to be a bumpy pride, is my conclusion.
Yeah,
But
we'll see.
yeah, conversations that need to happen. And as you say, we like to get into the weeds of what's going on. So I'm pleased we could have this conversation today, and I hope listeners have found this useful. Well, again,
Yep.
I'm sure we'll pick it up another day.
I'm sure. Great speaking with you,
And you,
Tanya.
Julie. Bye.